Yeah. So who did the invitation go out to everyone or just to the former R&D committee members?
No, it was publicly posted.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the
Our
initial
newsletter.
invitation went to the R&D members, and then it was in the newsletter for anyone to join. And we had the registration list is pretty good.
I received a number of notifications for this meeting, so it was distributed pretty widely.
Okay, started. So this is a new, well, first of all, hey, happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody.
Yay.
Oh.
We still have holidays, yay. So this is the first in a new format for the R&D committee. The R&D committee used to meet 3 or 4 times a year, and a few years ago, well, mostly with the first 5-year funding cycle, it started to dwindle a bit, and you know, we haven't had really regular meetings, and we haven't had good sort of contact between researchers and industry. And so we're hoping with Zoom, we can reestablish a regular contact. And so we're planning to have monthly meetings, and they'll be short. There'll be a 1-hour-long meeting with a presentation by a researcher, and a Q&A with that researcher, and then a general discussion with the committee about, you know, ways to move forward on that particular topic. And then, you know, if it's pertinent, we can move to wider topics. And so it's not an education sort of seminar per se. For the general industry, it's not telling a grower, you know, when to spray or what to spray. It's a research presentation, so you know the state of the research, right? So it is somewhat different from some of the other educational presentations that we put on and the grape growers put on. It's for the R&D committee. So I'm really excited about it. Our first presenter is Carl Bogdanoff, and he's presenting on managing cold weather grapevine hardiness, which is a project that has been funded by the Wine Grape Council and AAFC in the current cycle. And he also has volunteered to be our first presenter because this is his last ever talk, supposedly, because he's got a retirement date. So welcome, Carl Bogdanoff.
Okay. Let me get the share screen here.
So, sorry, if there's questions, accumulate them in the chat as we go, okay? And then Carl will address them at the end. Thanks.
All right, so can everyone see that? Oops. Move this over backwards. Okay. Ready? Yes. So predicting grapevine bud hardiness when our Arctic event's too cold. So one of the requirements for growing Vitis vinifera wine grapes anywhere in the world is that minimum temperatures never or rarely dip below minus 25 degrees centigrade. Minus 25 is a vine killing temperature. It's also important to note that less cold record low temperatures in the fall and in the spring are also very dangerous. And that's why I have this photo here. This just to make the point, I guess, that these Arctic events don't just happen in the dead of winter. So this picture was taken in October, that Thanksgiving weekend, October 10, 11, and 12, 2009. And at that time, there's actually very little wind. So there was a pretty big variation of low temperatures throughout the Okanagan Valley. But in some vineyards, it got down to -10 degrees or colder. And in those vineyards, there was a significant amount of bud and vine damage. Now, when I give a talk on bud hardiness, I always like to show this slide because it illustrates the risk of winter injury to grapevines here in Okanagan Valley. This black line here are the record low temperatures on a given day here and over the last plus 70 years or so. And the coldest day I got at Penticton Airport was in 1968 and it got down to -27.2. And the most recent cold event was in 2009, that Thanksgiving weekend. I also have on this plot here, this dotted blue line, those are the minimum temperatures for 2015 and 16. And the solid blue line, this is the bud hardiness line for Merlot in that same year. And it's called an LTE 50, which is a low temperature exotherm. And this line represents the temperature at which there is 50% bud mortality. So here in this slide, you can see that the dotted blue line never crosses the solid blue line there. So in the spring of 2016, there were very few there wasn't hardly any bud damage at all. But also on the other hand here, notice that the black line does cross this blue line often or once in a while. And if that were to happen, there would be significant vine and bud damage in the Okanagan Valley. Now in this talk, I'm going to talk about the bud hardiness model I've written for 8 cultivars here in the Okanagan Valley. And first in this talk, I sort of want to give you a bit of background on the data collection for this model, and then what these models are based on, and then move on to the usefulness of these models. So this model is based on the variety or the bud hardiness data I've been collecting for varieties since 2012. And back then I started with 11 cultivars and we sampled from 36 sites. Now we're up to 18 cultivars and we sampled from 72 sites. And the sampling protocol was like this. We selected sites and vines to be sampled, we flagged 6 vines per site every 2 weeks, late October to early April. We sampled 3 canes per site, determined hardiness, digital thermal analysis on 5 buds per cane, buds 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. This data for each site was then posted to growers within 2 days of sampling. Over here on the left is what the data we post to growers every 2 weeks. Here are the varieties. Here are the hardiness numbers here. And these numbers equal the mean bud mortality of temperature, the mortality temperature of 15 buds for 3 canes per site. Just give you a little quick synopsis on how we measure bud hardiness. We go out and collect a sample of the canes. We come back to the lab with those canes and we have to excise those buds. There's 5 buds per cane here. And so there's buds 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 here. And we can fit 9 canes on a tray. And we have 6 trays per freezer of 2 freezers. And so we can analyze 108 canes per day. At the end of the winter season, we have a really complete set of bud hardiness for all these cultivars. And this is, I guess, really good to have this data. And so what we do with this data, and what's really good about this data and makes it conducive for modeling, is that it's collected from multiple sites. And what we can do then is take an average of, and we get a really good average bud hardiness value across the whole winter season for each cultivar. So here, I've plotted just the bud hardiness data we've collected since 2012, and these are the 11 original varieties we sampled from. And this is your typical curve. You get this U-shaped curve here, and this curve can be divided into 3 sections. There's acclimation, maximum hardiness, and deacclimation. So acclimation occurs in October, November, and basically your bud hardiness is increasing throughout this period as temperatures fall. During the period of maximum hardiness, that's December, January, and February, you're at your maximum hardiness levels. They can fluctuate 1 or 2 degrees depending on warm spells or cool spells during this period. And then there's deacclimation, where the buds actually lose hardiness and they get ready for bud break as spring approaches. Also notice that the grapevine cultivars differ here in bud hardiness. And what's really interesting about this data, this ranking of hardiness is very consistent from year to year. This is just the same slide as I just showed you, and it just has the 2 varieties here, Merlot and Chardonnay. And you can see here Chardonnay is considerably more hardy than Merlot during acclimation and maximum hardiness, and then it loses that advantage during deacclimation and actually breaks buds sooner than Merlot. Here I've plotted the actual bud hardiness for Merlot for all 8 years here. And so you can see there's a huge amount of variation in bud hardiness from year to year. And it's kind of like, and it's based on weather. So it's kind of like weather. It's like no 2 years are alike, and the same can be said about bud hardiness here. So here I just want to sort of make the point of the temperature effects on bud hardiness. This line here is 2015-16 2-day mean temperature. Now I use the 2-day mean temperature because it smooths this data line out a little bit. It makes it easier for me to work with. And this is what I use in the bud hardiness model. Down here is Merlot's bud hardiness on those sample days. And it's a typical U-shaped curve, except there are a few wrinkles here and there. And these wrinkles are caused by temperatures. And so you can see here, as temperatures increase, you lose bud hardiness. As temperatures fall, you gain bud hardiness, and temperatures increase again, you lose bud hardiness. So there's really a direct kind of cause and effect here, which means bud hardiness is amenable to modeling. So over those 8 years, I've written models and rewritten them and reworked them. And through that process, I've kind of learned that there are 3 groups of data that I need to make these models work. And so the first batch is need a starting data set. And what I use here is current season's growing degree day total. So cool growing seasons delay the onset of hardiness accumulation. Warm growing seasons promote earlier hardiness accumulation. Over here is the Summerland's growing degree accumulation chart. And hopefully you've all seen this. And there's a big variation in warm seasons versus cool seasons here. Down here is a table of growing degree days for the last 8 years, which are in the model. And here you can see, for example, 2015 was a very warm or hot growing season. And so there were 130 extra growing degree days above average. And so the starting point for the model is actually almost -4 degrees on September 20th. The second element or batch of data is the baseline data. And this is the bud hardiness measurements from the Okanagan Valley here. So here I've plotted Merlot's bud hardiness for 2012, 2020. And these little blue dots down here represent the average bud hardiness for Merlot for each of those sample dates. This red dotted line that runs through this data is actually the bud hardiness line for Merlot. And so I give it the name just the estimated LTE 50 line. And to get the estimated LTE 50 per day, you just subtract the previous day from the current day, and that gives you that per day measure. Now this line, this bud hardiness line here, it's a 4th order polynomial equation, and it works really well for this data because that equation allows for this little flat area or smoothing out of the curve here during the period of maximum hardiness. And during this period, you know, the estimated LTE per day is actually gets down to 0, and it's not a usable number in the model. So during maximum hardiness, I've set inside the model estimated LTE per day just to be at 0.1. The other thing from this chart, estimated LT50s are unique for each cultivar. The third data element or batch is the weather data. So here I use Penticton's historic and current daily mean temperatures. And this is a graph of 2-day mean temperature for Penticton. This is the historic line right here, this red line, and it's the mean temperature from 1981 to 2010. So it's an average of 30 years. For this example here is I use the mean temperature 2018 and 19. And so what I use here is the difference of current temperature and historic temperature. So here you see we're above average, you get warm numbers, and here we're below average and we get negative numbers. So the difference between Penticton's 2-day temperature mean and its historical 2-day temperature mean is used to create multipliers that affect the rate of estimated LTE per day. This variable is generated daily and it drives the hardiness model. So every day, the 2-day mean is calculated and entered into the model. And the model itself is just a bunch of equations, and it generates the daily predicted bud hardiness value. And at the end of the year, one of the things that you have to do is kind of check and see how well the models worked. And one of the ways, and actually I have two criteria that I use to judge whether the models work or not. And so one of the ways is for the first, to get at that first criteria is to plot actual bud hardiness against predicted bud hardiness. A high R-square value, those above 95% indicate predicted bud hardiness closely matched actual bud hardiness. And so the first criteria here for me anyway, from making the model, knowing the model worked, was the R-square has, if R-squares are less than 0.95, then the model equations are reworked. The second criteria I use the difference between actual hardiness, which is the measured bud hardiness, versus predicted bud hardiness. And so the second criteria is if the difference between the actual and predicted hardiness was more than plus or minus 1.5 degrees, then the model equations were again reworked. And so this is the table of those differences here for each year. The red or pink numbers are predicted values that are above actual measured value. The green ones are a little bit too low, but this whole table, all the values are within that 1.5 degree range. And the good thing about this, or the interesting thing, I can actually adjust the model as the season progresses. But the actual, I guess, proof of the pudding here is to plot actual hardiness against predicted hardiness. And here I did this from below, so all 8 years. And you can see the two lines actually on top of each other. And so it works really well. And the R squares here are quite high. If you average all these R squares from below, it's above 97%. Over here on the left is just the list of varieties that I made models for. So it's Cab Sauv, Chardonnay, Merlot, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Syrah. So the model works really well, I think. And so we have this predicted bud hardiness number. And so what does it really mean? And so it's kind of a fuzzy number. Say, for example, the posted bud hardiness from Merlot in January is minus 23.7 degrees. And what people see is, wow, that's pretty precise. It's down to 1/10 of a degree. Well, actually, there's a lot of variation attached to that number. So a posted bud hardiness value, the LTE50, is the mean temperature for bud mortality. Plus or minus 2 degrees C from that mean generally means an LTE10 and the LTE90 or 10% or 90% bud mortality. So there's a wide range in bud hardiness within a vineyard. And this chart here sort of shows that. In this chart, I collected 72 canes from 72 vines in a Merlot vineyard here. And those 72 canes will if I check just 5 buds on each cane, that gives me 360 peaks I can capture. So here I plotted all those peaks, and you can see that the bud hardness varies by 4.7 degrees from the LTE10 to the LTE90 here. And so that's a lot of variation even within your block. And so on top of that variation, you have to look at, there's a wide range of cold temperatures. So cold temperatures can vary from site to site and within a vineyard. And during periods of calm, cold air flows and pools like water, and temperature differences can become very pronounced. And so this, you've probably seen this map before. We soaked this block of grapes here with temperature sensors. There's a frost pocket down here, this deep blue area. And the temperature down here is 6 degrees colder than up here on the hill. And then this point up here on the hill is less than 200 meters away. So there's a lot of variation going on here. So knowing about hardiness, how useful is it? Well, it is kind of useful still. So these models give growers the daily estimate of bud and vine hardness from October 20th to April 15th. And for many of this kind of equals simply peace of mind. There are days in the wintertime where it's minus 15 or 17 outside, and you're wondering how your grapevines are doing. But if if hardiness is down to minus 20 or minus 22, you really don't have to worry. So you don't have to think about it too much. The other thing the bud hardiness values and numbers give you is knowing bud hardiness informs growers on when to use wind machines. The more efficiently you can use your wind machines, the better. They're very expensive to run. It also saves time and money on reducing the frequency of bud hardiness testing. Right now we test buds every 2 weeks, and we can easily reduce that down to once a month. Now, on the other hand, if the forecast looks bad and if you don't have wind machines, then really it's kind of like, so what? There's not much growers can do as Arctic weather approaches and temperatures plummet. Afterwards, though, growers will have an idea on the level of cold damage in their vineyards, and they will know if assessing for bud damage is warranted or not. Which kind of brings us to this slide here, assessing for winter injury. I would recommend checking for bud damage if ambient temperatures were within 2 degrees of predicted bud hardiness. I would allow 3 to 7 days after a potentially damaging cold event before sampling buds. You should sample from your vineyard cold spots first. If no bud damage, then the rest of the vineyard is okay. When sampling, randomly collect 20 canes and evaluate 3 to 5 buds per cane. Assess buds by cutting off the top 1/3 to 1/2 with a razor blade to expose the bud primordias. Damaged bud primordias will be brown, healthy buds, primordias will be green. So here's a nice healthy bud over here. This is your primary bud right in the middle. Here the primary bud has been killed, and this is your secondary and tertiary bud. And here this bud's been totally killed. So if you know how much damage your buds have received, you can adjust your pruning levels. And so if you have less than 25% primary bud death, I would still prune normally. If there's 25 to 75% primary bud death, then I would prune lightly, and that entails just leaving longer spurs with more buds or leaving extra canes. If you have 75% primary bud death, then I would just still prune normally, basically, but keep all spurs. Expect phloem damage and focus on vine recovery, and hope some latent buds push in the wood from the wood of your cordons and the crown of your vine. So for growers, cold weather events this year, 2020, 2021, the Okanagan Valley, there are actually 2 of them. And the first one was October 25th. The day before, I had to harvest my vineyard, and it was like freezing outside, and there was 8 inches of snow, and the leaves were still on the vine and stuff. The other cold period was last month in February. But here I plotted the minimum temperatures in Penticton at that time, or for this year so far. And you can see the bud hardness levels, the actual and the predicted so far this year, were well below what the minimum temperatures were. So for this year, there's little or no injury to mature Vitis vinifera grape buds this winter. Of course, there's a little bit of a catch. On February 12th, it got down to minus 18.6 in Kelowna. And also at that time, February 11th, bud hardiness for all 8 cultivars on average was minus 23. For your more tender varieties, it's probably minus 22 or so. And then for newly planted vineyards, vines are about 2 or 3 degrees less hardy than older vines. So for new vineyards in the Kelowna area and north, there might be some winter damage. And lastly, I just want to end up on a positive note here. The annual minimum temperatures from 1919 to 2018 here. So over the last 100 years, cold weather events have become less frequent and less cold, and record minimum temperatures are on average 3 degrees warmer than they were 100 years ago. And so that's my presentation. I'd like to acknowledge Mission Hill Family Estate Winery and Artera Wines Canada. They help collect the buds every 2 weeks. BC Wine Grape Council and AAFC, DIAP, and AIP initiatives for funding, and for this latest round of funding, the Canadian Grapevine Certification Network and the AAFC CAP initiative. And there you have it. So I guess any questions?
So if you have questions, I think you could just unmute and speak up.
Well, I do have a question in regards to the time lapse between when you have substantial winter temperature changes. How long does it take for the LT50 to adapt to that?
So as like cold air, as your Arctic front comes down and it gets pretty cold pretty fast, you know, your bud hardiness can adjust, probably pick up maybe a ½ degree of hardiness. So as it comes down, if it's kind of slowly gets colder, your vines are actually gaining hardiness as that cold front approaches. Still, temperature can get really, really cold faster than the vines can acclimate. And once, wherever that hardiness level is, if temperatures get below that, then you're going to have some winter injury. And I'm not sure if that answers your questions. In the fall and the spring, you saw that U-shaped curve. So your hardiness levels kind of follow that U-shaped curve. You know, it doesn't take as cold temperatures to damage your buds in the fall or the spring.
Any other questions? So Carl, where does this go from here with you leaving?
Well, so also I've connected up with Lizzie Wolkovich at UBC, and she's a kind of a world-renowned modeler actually. And she's building a dashboard, or she has a student building a dashboard, and we'll have a link. And so hopefully we'll get that next year. And with that link, growers can just click on that link and see what the predicted bud hardiness is for that day, basically. And so it's still in the works, but as I retire, I still kind of like, I kind of see a few things through. And so hopefully that'll get, get in place and running.
And do you have any recommendations for, other means of expanding this kind of work? There's always,
like, off the top of my head, there's always questions. I always have lots of them. As you go, it's kind of like the nature of research. The more you know, the more you don't know. So yes, there are lots of little things I would like to explore, and I'll for sure share those ideas with my successor. Off the top of my head, I can't think of too much right now, but there are like a lot of nuances that really need to be explored.
Jo?
Yep. Well, thank you for this presentation. I have a question. I was wondering, I don't know if actually my interrogation is very relevant, but in addition to temperature, do you think there is any additional determinants may affect the hardiness of the bud, orientation of the vineyards, exposure to special winds? I don't know, or is it only the temperature is actually may explain everything, and there is no other possibility to reduce, let's say, the effect of the temperature?
Well, there's there's lots of things that affect cold hardiness, and I guess one of the things is, well, the first thing to do is site selection. So there's a big difference in where your vineyard's located and how cold it gets in your vineyard and stuff like that. And then the varieties, they separate out into different levels of hardiness also. So the variety is important. Also, whether you're harvesting late or early, or whether it's a hot season or cool season, has an impact on hardiness. There's probably others I can't think of off the top of my head. Also, you should really water your vines in the fall, get those roots well watered. And that's another thing. A couple of years ago, we had this event. It was pretty unusual. It was very cold in March, and there was snow on the ground, so the roots didn't warm up. And it wasn't really winter damage where we had a lot of bud damage. It was basically the buds dried out because the roots were so cold, and it actually warmed up really quickly in March. And so the buds were wanting water, but the roots weren't functioning properly. So the buds just kind of desiccated. So it had really poor bud break, especially in vineyards that were on heavy soils, because those soils didn't warm up as quickly. So there are things you can do, but when you're watching, like when you look at the forecast and you see the weather coming down, or Arctic R front coming down, there's really not much you can do in the moment as you see winter coming. And just hope for the best.
Okay.
So Carl, I assume that the sample sites are, of well-hardened canes, right? Like probably like best practice examples of canopy management, and right?
Right.
So something less than that would put you at risk as well, right?
Well, there's a little bit of vineyard management. We've done a lot of study on crop load and stuff like that. And crop load really doesn't affect hardiness too much, unless you're like an extreme case. But so where we sample our canes is mostly from Mission Hill and Arterra vineyards. And so they use very standard growing practices and stuff like that. Where you do find differences if you have a super vigorous vineyard, large canes, bull canes are less hardy than normal canes. And actually shorter canes are hardier than they are hardiest of all. So you're growing, it does make a difference. Like if you really push those vines, whether it's super vigorous or they're super stressed by disease or something like that, their hardiness will be impacted.
Any other questions for Carl?
Yeah, what about impact of rootstock on the hardiness? Have you found any substantial differences, or not really?
It's actually, that's good. Thanks, Hans. Yeah, that's another thing. Rootstocks make a big difference, especially in new plantings. So rootstocks, we usually use, rootstocks here in Okanagan are kind of used for mostly, I guess, vigor control. Otherwise, you could also, use rootstocks for phylloxera, and someday they may show up here in the valley. So it's kind of an insurance on that. But so rootstocks are used pretty widely up here. And those rootstocks that tend to devigorate vine tend to promote bud hardiness up on the scion. And it's really, I guess, the effect is very prominent, especially when vines are young. And so newly planted vines are like can be 2 or 3 degrees hardier than an own rooted vine. And then there is like the different rootstocks, some rootstocks that don't devigorate very well. Those don't promote as much hardiness to the buds and the scion. So yes, and I can't remember. I'll probably put out a little newsletter on that too, about rootstocks and which rootstocks. We've tested 8 rootstocks, and of those 8, we'll put out a list which ones do better for young vineyards. Once a vineyard's 4 or 5 years old, the rootstock effect kind of disappears, but the vine's more mature, and so the hardiness is what it is.
And would that also apply if you look at more mature unrooted plants? Would they come closer then to grafted plants?
Yeah, they sort of all have the same hardiness after once a vine's 4 or 5 years old. It doesn't matter what the rootstock is. So unrooted vines are just as hardy as those on rootstocks. The big advantage for unrooted vines, though, if it does get cold enough to kill the top part of your vine, it's very easy to retrain a sucker up, and you can have a full crop within 2 years again. So you'll be back in business pretty fast. Whereas on rootstocks and the top dies, you got to replant, and it takes 3 or 4 years to fully recover.
Le pire, c'est que je les regarde jamais.
Uh-oh.
Mehdi, did you want to?
You're on mute.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
There you go.
Okay, sorry. Carl, thanks so much for the presentation. Very informative and lots of work that you put into this, very valuable information. I wanted to mention that there's some claims by the seaweed companies that seaweed spraying may impact the cold hardiness. And there's some data out there, not extensive data on the grapes. So I have an experiment. So one of my sites is in the same spot that you have in Arturo's vineyard. And I have a master's student that this year we decided to collect the cold hardiness data. And we did it every 2 weeks early in the season and later at this time, and then monthly in between. So we have a set of data. We still haven't had a chance to analyze it, but we're excited to see if there is any impact. We did 6 spraying during the season and 1 last spray after harvest, which they suggested that last spray has impact on the cold hardiness. Also, we had soil treatment. So we had 2 soil applications earlier in the season. So we would be, after we analyze the data, we would be able to see if there is any impact. We're going to continue that next year as well. Thank you.
I have another question in regards to early fall frost. I mean, there are some sites that lose their foliage much sooner than normal.
Right.
In terms of impact, is there anything that can be done about this? I saw that there was some research in trying to actually increase the point, lower the point where the foliage freezes through. I mean, there seems to be some kind of a phenomenon happening with when, not exactly sure how this works. Maybe you can explain this a little bit. I think Glenn McGordy did some work on this, and I've seen a few others, but not really much conclusions coming out of this.
Right. So, yeah, in early fall, actually, so vines that senesce earlier than a neighboring vine, those vines are hardier in the fall than vines that don't senesce. So if you have natural leaf fall, that's early, that's great, because then you have more ABA in your vine, and ABA seems to be implicated in bud hardiness. And so the more you have, the better hardiness you have. And we've done a bunch of trials with ABA, and it was kind of like it was too variable, the results, to really be worthwhile, in our opinion. But ABA is one of those components. And I think Jim Wilworth at Covey is working a lot on that right now. Early leaf fall, I have an experiment actually going on this year where I'm going to have different irrigation treatments and fertilizer treatments combined and look at senescence basically. And mixed in with that is right after harvest, I'm going to strip all the leaves off some vines and see what kind of impact that has on hardiness, if any. It's kind of like, what does that cold, frost event, what does that do to hardiness if it happens in October, like during harvest, and all the leaves fall off? I guess we'll see. So I'm not sure how much impact, I guess, early leaf removal or these sprays. The other thing we sort of found, like these nitrogen treatments, late nitrogen treatments tend to reduce bud hardiness just because, again, that delays senescence, and that delay of senescence reduces hardiness during acclimation.
So that doesn't sound like you're retiring.
Well, I'm just, as part of me, I'm kind of curious. So if I have a question, I'll kind of look it up, whether I'm paid to do it or not.
Carl, I have a question just following up to what you just said about your experiments about irrigation and senescence, and I was an ABA as well, as you just mentioned. So
yeah.
Are those experiments indicating, or maybe other experiments you have done, that if you have some deficit and maybe that speed up the lignification or the senescence might help, or actually might be like well, not as good for bud hardiness?
Well, we did do an experiment 2 years ago, and we wanted to repeat it last year, but we couldn't. And so we've looked at deficit irrigation a lot, and it doesn't have a big effect on bud hardiness, whether you deficit irrigate or not. This latest experiment that we've only got 1 year on is we tried reducing early irrigation in springtime. And the result of that was kind of interesting because you do get shorter shoots with the reduced irrigation treatments. And the irrigation treatments were before bloom, up to bloom, and then right after. And these reduced irrigation was actually no water was applied all the way to past fruit set. And so shorter shoots were hardier than longer, more vigorous shoots. The bad thing about that was that the irrigation treatments reduced yield. And so, there's, I guess, the advantage of increased hardiness was far outweighed by the loss of yield. So I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Thank you. And congratulations about the model. It seems that, the prediction are, spot on. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And this year, so keep your fingers crossed. This year I haven't had to make any adjustments to it. So we'll see.
So we have about 15 minutes left. So, we want to talk about, other areas related to this topic that we might want to see research. So, that's open to both industry, like, what do we want to know? What are we interested in? As well as researchers, what can we offer you? So yeah, I'll just open it up. We have, we have a goal to have our priorities set a year from now so that we can start working on the proposal for the 2023, the start of the 2023 funding cycle. So yeah, this is how we're gonna start collecting these priorities. Brett's got a question for Carl again. Why don't you unmute, Brett? So the question, Carl, is, are you more likely to see bud damage closer to the crown or further down the cordon?
Actually, it's pretty well. So we've done a lot of bud damage or work with phloem tissue too. So we found like phloem tissue is a little less hardy in the canes than buds, like about a degree or so. And but on the other hand, it takes a lot more damage to affect shoot growth and bud development. So really it's kind of like almost pretty much the same. So a lot of people worry about phloem damage all the time. And it's like, if your buds are okay, your phloem is probably okay. Problem with phloem though, if you have an extended cold period, phloem is more vulnerable to extended cold temperatures than buds are. As opposed to like the height of your vine, where there's a difference between the upper part or along the cordon. Really, we haven't seen any difference. The phloem seems to be about as hardy when it's in the cordon, in the trunk, as buds are. And then once you get down to the soil, again, the temperatures are very much moderated down below the soil surface. So again, your trunk is a lot less hardy down there, and so are the roots. But then, the soil's a lot warmer, sort of thing. But like this last cold spell was interesting because there's absolutely no snow on the ground when it got cold, down to minus 15 degrees. And so maybe some young vineyards, even down in the Penticton area, might have some issues because their roots aren't fully developed yet and they could have froze. But again, that cold period didn't last too long. So I'm not sure. I don't have to look at, we have temperature sensors buried out at the research station, and we can look at how cold it gets, how deep down that freezing gets also. But in general, there's really not much difference between the lower part of the trunk or at the end of the cordon.
So Carl, you can probably see Jose has suggested that you speak a bit on the impact that diseases have on bud hardiness, since you have been working on that. Sure.
So I guess, we've worked on viruses a lot, and the impact there is kind of interesting. There's kind of a trade-off here. So for viruses, if it's not severe, and you have like it's basically like a leaf roll virus will delay ripening a little bit. So what you get you got two things going on here. You get delayed ripening, so that impacts your bud hardiness. But on the other hand, you have reduced shoot growth because of the virus, which then improves hardiness. And so the two kind of cancel each other out. And so it doesn't really affect hardiness that much. And only once your diseases take, I guess, full control of your vine and they're on the decline, then, your bud hardiness begins to be affected that way. We saw with red blotch virus that there was a huge effect on hardiness. And so it looked like red blotch is associated with ABA development within the grapevine. And we noticed, like Jose took this great picture in the fall, like all the vines, we had a plot with red blotch sprinkled through this block. And all the vines that had red blotch, all the leaves were still hanging on that vine at the end of October, while all the other healthy vines, all the leaves had fallen off. So it's a really good indication that ABA is being affected by red blotch. And then again, like other diseases like trunk diseases, we really don't see an effect on hardiness unless it's becomes super severe. And by that time, you probably want your vine to die anyway and plant a new one.
Yeah, you need a second reason, right?
Yep.
So I think that covers Jesse's question as well. How disease stress impacts early senescence and into hardiness, which you could cover. Yeah. So now we have 8 minutes left. if there are no further comments or questions on this particular topic, there are, we'd like suggestions for sort of next talks. So we plan to do this once a month. I know today's Wednesday, but it's going to be third Thursdays after this, so that it'll be, easy to remember. And we're sketching out a schedule of talks, but we don't have it yet, and we're waiting for sort of suggestions of what people would like to see. The current research projects funded by the Wine Grape Council are on the website. So certainly any of those researchers would be interested in letting us know, where they are with their research. But, it's open to wider topics as well. And, as well as people from outside the area. We're hoping that the next talk will be on GIS mapping from Pat, but I don't really have that confirmed yet because Pat is also retiring. And so, we'd love to hear one last time from her as well. So I think probably the best way to send those suggestions is to send them to Kate. And unless anybody has anything they want to throw out there at this moment, because that's cool too.
I mean, one question I have is about rootstock selection. Are there any good or firm recommendations that someone could make for the, say, for the Okanagan or even for the Lower Mainland area? Or is information that is out there from everywhere in the world good enough for our specific circumstance?
So maybe the researchers can send through some suggestions on who sort of has a comprehensive grasp on that body of knowledge. Carl, were you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say, actually, people who would really be pretty informed on that would be, Mike Watson at Arterra and Rob Achurch at Mission Hill. Mm-hmm. They have, vineyards planted all over the place. And so they have a lot of experience with rootstocks and what they prefer and things like that and what they're after. And, the questions are, for rootstocks, it's huge. It's variable. I guess one, you're after fruit and wine quality. The other things you're after are like whether to control vigor. Then there's also other ailments, nematodes and diseases and things to worry about too. So it's a wide open topic. And I know they've been doing a lot of research on it in California, and it tends to be the results tend to be very site specific and which rootstocks do better. So again, I would say, experience that Mike and Rob have would be something that would be very useful to tap into.
Right. Yeah, so that might be a good panel discussion for one meeting.
Just a follow-up thought on that, coming from the tree fruit sides of thing. We had, I believe Denise Nielsen started it, but there was a rootstock trial for apples at the research center. And it was part of a group, an international group, and they had the same rootstock trial set up across North America, and they monitored it for about 10 years. They all collaborated, took the same sort of reading measurements, and it seems like the results are just coming out now, but it seemed very exciting, and it really helped to understand how rootstock affect the trees within the different regions. The same rootstock and the same scion. Perhaps somebody, a researcher, AAFC or outside, might be interested in starting up something similar for vines across the vine growing regions of North America.
Yeah, that's ideal for the National Grape Cluster, right? Anything else? We've got 3 minutes. We're finishing exactly on time. This is important to keep you coming. I know we've had R&D meetings in the past that have been hours and hours long. And while it's very valuable, it's also exhausting.
No, just
Carl-
if I may, one thing, once we have had a few of these presentations, we should really start talking about setting priorities on a fairly large scale for the next 5-year program.
Yeah.
It's great to have some input to sort of trigger our interest and curiosity. But timeline-wise, I mean, by the end of this year, we have to have a fairly firm list of activities that we want to pursue in the next go around.
Yeah, so maybe what we should do is like every fourth meeting, just have it be a priority setting meeting, right? And just have a general discussion about that. Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl. We're gonna miss you. I miss you already. I missed you all
really.
year.
Well, I have to say, it's like this job has been it's been a it was a great job. It was fun. And it's just part of my nature. I just, I always have questions about things. And so I had the opportunity to actually investigate and look for answers to some of my questions. And so it really didn't feel like work. So
That's awesome.
I'm going to miss it actually, but I'll probably keep digging around and keep looking.
Well,
Stay in contact.
That's good to hear. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for coming. We'll see you. I think third Thursday in April is the 17th. Is that right, Kate? 15th, April 15th. It's on the screen. And yeah, we hope to see you then. Again, the R&D committee is a volunteer group. As a subcommittee of the BC Wine Grape Council, but it's open to any industry member who's interested. And so if you have a colleague that you think might be interested and would love to add to this, please encourage them to come to the next meeting. Again, we'll send the invite out first to the committee and then just in a general newsletter. So anyone can join this group and we'd love to have you. Thanks, and we'll see you in April. Okay, bye.